You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
And welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 271 for August 23rd, 2023. I'm your host, Chris Webster. On today's show, we continue our discussion about proposals. So be sure to listen to part 1 on episode 270 because the CRM Archaeology Podcast starts right now. Welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me today is Andrew with his coffee mug in California.
What's up, y'all? It's nice to be back.
Heather's back in the kitchen, also in California.
With my coffee mug.
With your coffee mug. And we've also got Doug in Scotland, presumably with like tea or something.
No, man, I don't do that. I don't mess with tea. I don't mess with coffee.
What?
You know, only hard drugs for me.
Only hard drugs. Nice. Well, as you may assume, we are, if you're listening to the audio of this, which I'm assuming you are because our numbers on YouTube are not like super high, but we are recording video, except for Doug. He stays mysterious for, plausible deniability and anonymity, but that's a tough word to say. Anyway, we are on video and we are publishing these to the Archaeology Podcast Network YouTube channel. So if you want to see a relatively unedited version of this, although I've come up with a way to possibly get the video and the audio edited at the same time. So these might get a little bit more cleaned up on the YouTube side of things. But either way, hopefully we don't make too many mistakes because I'm probably not doing that for this episode, but we'll see. So last week, if you missed it, we discussed proposals, episode 271. Go check that out. We'll link to it in the show notes. But we had so much to talk about that we only got through a little over half of our bullet points of the things we actually wanted to talk about. So it'll be fun to, continue this conversation because there was so much more to talk about, so many more things we wanted to say. And we're just gonna kick that off right now. So, I mean, I've got the first bullet point up here, but is there anything just maybe from Andrew? I know you listened to the episode because you weren't on last week because you were on a photo shoot probably, or some sort of talent scouting trip in Hawaii or something. I don't really know.
The calendar has to come out at some point, so I got to get ready for that. Stuff.
Right. But do either of you guys have any initial comments, just maybe off of last week's episode, or do you just want to head right into it?
Sure. I just have a quick comment to say. I listened to the episode yesterday, and I thought it was great. This is the kind of episode that I think the CRM podcast is made for. The what is the proposal thing. That last episode, I'm definitely going to have my students listen to because it kind of takes the wool off your eyes. It's like, this is the why of the project. This is everything. Boils down to this. It answers so many questions like, why are we getting paid so little? Why is this project doing this? Hey, we found this thing. Why don't we move over here? Why don't we look at that other hillside? It's like, hey man, look at the proposal. The proposal is your map to what you must do. So I just thought it was great.
Nice. All right. Heather, any comments off of last week or things you want to start with?
No, I think we'll cover it in this episode.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. And Doug's muted. I assume if he had something to say, he wouldn't be, but I can't see him, so I don't know. Doug?
No, I'm good.
All right. So one of the things we didn't really get to talk about, and this is the first point we have from last week, was what do you do when you lose a proposal? We kind of touched on it a little bit, going back to the agency and figuring out why you lost the proposal. If they'll tell you that. If it's a private company, they might not tell you that, but if it's an agency, they likely will. But what can we do to, I don't know, strengthen our proposals for next time, or just learn from that experience? Heather, as anybody who's written proposals, you've probably lost more than you've won. That's just how it goes.
No, I don't lose any.
Everybody.
I actually,
right.
I mean, you all. I think I'm proud to say I have a pretty good win rate, but you do. Yeah, of course you're going to lose. In fact, we talked about it the last time, and sometimes it boggles your mind that you lose. I mean, I said an example of the last episode is that I lost because my bid was too low. That was so
Yeah.
frustrating because the agency said, well, we think that you didn't have a grasp on, what the actual task was because your bid was so low. And they said
Yeah.
your scope was great, the proposal was great, it was well thought out, but you were too low, so we don't think you truly know what it takes to make this happen. And I'm like, well, that's only because you've been trained by people who have been, I don't know, scamming you, but you've been trained by people that have elevated the price to a point. They're working with outdated. I think a lot of CRM firms are working with outdated strategies, right? And they're not using technologies. Now, we did talk about this in the last episode, and that is sometimes, passing those efficiencies that you have, developed over time is a good thing, is a good way of, kind of you meet in the middle ground. I don't think you stay with the same price necessarily because you do need to be competitive in the market. But I think that you've worked hard to create and develop these efficiencies that I think somewhere in the middle, right? Bringing your price down enough so that you have some more room, you can pay people more and whatnot. But I think that I don't think you should stay at the same price necessarily because eventually you are going to be worked out of the market. I mean, it's so,
Right.
but it was frustrating. It was a learning experience. And one aspect that I learned there is that you have to really know the agencies that you're proposing for. You have to know what it
Sure.
is that they are looking for, what their little idiosyncrasies are. You also have to understand sometimes it's not even worth bidding on a project because you know that they have their shoe-in company that they want to use. And in fact, that's what I
Yeah.
think really happened there. I was told that we were too low. They couldn't criticize anything else about our proposal, but that's what they say is that we were too low. I think it's because they had already decided who they were going to hire, but they had to put the bid out, and so that was their excuse for not selecting us. Because the company that got hired is the same company they work for over and over again. And we could talk about that as far as when do you
Sure.
decide to bid and when do you decide to decline. But
Well, one of the things that really frustrates me about all that is I wish agencies, honestly, I don't know why there's so much cloak and dagger, to be honest with you. It's especially with the public agencies, right? Like BLM, Forest Service, some of the others, military, stuff like that. I mean, if there is a threshold, a low and a high, I mean, publish it with the requirements. You know what I'm saying? Like literally, if you're over this, we're not going to give it to you. If you're under this, we don't think you can do it. But if you can, justify why you think you can, right? And it's just like,
some do
why?
actually.
Some do, you're right. Some do, yeah, but more often than not, they don't, and you
Yeah.
just kind of have to guess that you're
Minute.
in line with everybody else, and that you're not either blowing it out or you're not charging enough, right? So
Right.
anyway, I just wish they would do that. But I think my big feedback from losing proposals is, I mean, if you win a lot, you might take this a little differently. But if you're like most small companies just starting out, and you're winning 10% of the proposals that you write, literally don't let it bother you. Learn from it,
Yes.
move on, and write the
Yes.
next one. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
also be careful about writing too many at the same time, because I mean, you might win more than one, and then you're really in trouble.
Yeah.
I mean, for
That was
small
going to
companies.
be that was going to be my question. Have you guys ever been surprised when you won? When you were sort of planning to not, you're like, this ain't going to work, and then you're like, oh, whoa, I guess we're doing this. Has that happened to
No.
you guys?
No, of course not, because that's how proposal writing works. You're like, damn right, I won that project. Exactly, guys.
Yeah. No, we've had. I can distinctly
Yeah, it's not for the real world.
I can distinctly remember a few times where I've sat back and like, oh my goodness, we won. Now what do we do? Yeah,
Yeah.
Right.
there are times where you bid and you're doing it for the exercise of it, for the practice of it, for learning. Actually, sometimes you're putting out the hook to get an idea for the next time. How are you going to strategize, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes you're not going to win a proposal,
Right.
or you don't expect to win a proposal, but you're learning about the agency because you want to win the proposals in the future. And so you're kind of just practicing with that agency. And so when you win, there have been a couple times where we win and we're like, oh boy, because that's especially if you've never worked with them before, this is your one opportunity to really show what you got. Now, and that pressure is a little, unnerving sometimes, because you feel like you have one chance to really knock it out of the park, or you don't get a chance with the agency again. So.
Right.
Yeah. Just I do have one, being all serious, that we did win that was a little bit shocking. And it was the biggest project my company, well, I guess now it's the second biggest project my company has ever done. But it was when I was a sub for another big company in Southern California that won that 5-year IDIQ. And the only thing I really got out of that, they did a bunch of small stuff after this, but we won back to back that had to be basically done in the same year, a 15,000 acre survey in El Centro, California, followed immediately by a 30,000 acre survey at China Lake Naval Weapons Center. And like I said, I'm a small company. Usually I've got one, maybe, a few other people, but I had to have like 8 people and the vehicles. And I went from like 0 to 1,000%, in a very short period of time. I mean, I had to get a loan initially to cover payroll. I just didn't have the money in the bank. And then, I worked with the company to basically let me invoice them so I could just turn right around and give it to my employees as per diem and payroll. And it was a little stressful, but winning those 2 back to back was, I knew we had a good chance of getting something, but I didn't know it's going to be that big. You know what I mean? That was a tough year.
Right. Right. Sure.
Yeah. Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, back to the comment of like, I would say in my experience, there's very little correlation for the amount of work you put into a bid and the ones you actually win or lose. In the sense of like, there'll be ones where you're like, yes, you spent days, you thought it was the most perfect one. No, don't get it. There's other ones where you sort of toss in that boilerplate and you're like, yeah, I mean, it's not bad. So I'd say like, I've never had one of those like sort of Hail Mary, like, oh, we have 2 hours to do this, let's just throw something together. It's complete crap. Usually we don't do that last minute stuff. Like if we're not going to be able to do a good proposal, we don't usually do the Hail Mary because it doesn't usually work.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, usually don't do that. So, but again, there's like, we put in, I'd say if we're going to do a proposal, we'll do a decent proposal. But like on that scale of like decent to like, oh man, this is the most perfect proposal I've ever put in, there's no correlation of like, our win-loss ratio on like that. So yeah, it's not quite that like we've put in crap ones and they're surprised when we get it. There's ones that we put in that we're like, oh, it'd be nice if we get it, and then we get it, and that's great.
Yeah.
And there's others that we're like, oh yes, we should definitely get this. We did so much, and we don't. But that's not quite that sort of that same level that you guys are discussing.
Right. No, that was the base of my question, just because I've had those kind of experiences in proposals in the academic world, where you do it and you do your due diligence and you do it well, but you're like, I got like an 11% chance of getting this, and then you put your resources kind of somewhere else. And then you have to backtrack. You're like, whoa, wait, we do have an extra 2 weeks over here, or, whatever it may be. So I like that sort of behind the scenes story of, sometimes you lose when you think you're going to win and win when you think you're going to lose.
Yeah.
Heather. And sometimes you usually don't know the odds going in as well. So you don't know who's going to be bidding and, how many proposals. And sometimes you find that out when they let you know. They're like, oh, yeah, we had 25 people and you were like number 23 or 2. The second is the worst. Or, we had 2 and you're number 2, which also stings a lot as well. But yeah, like it's really sometimes hard to guess those odds unless you know it really well, as Heather was talking about, and you get to really know whoever's putting out that tender. And then you start to get a feel of what they like and who's likely to get it. But for the most part, yeah. Sometimes I've gotten projects where they're like, well, we put out a tender and you're the only one that put in a usable tender, so you got it. And that's always a nice feeling as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say
Heather, final comment before we go to break.
Yeah, I agree with Doug. There is little correlation between what you win and the effort you put into it, typically. But, we're not talking right now. We're talking about agency bids where they really do have to look at the various, proposals that they get, and they have to have a certain amount of proposals typically that come in. Sometimes they don't have enough that come in and they have to reissue the RFP. But then there's also the proposals that you do where you have a very good client relationship and you're churning out these proposals and you're winning them. And sometimes that's the smaller work, but that's your bread and butter that keeps you going while, you're waiting for those bigger opportunities. So those ones where you have a really good relationship with the client, you don't mess with the formula that you have, and those are quick, and the effort that you put into the proposal is a lot less than these other larger proposals. So,
right,
and they're easier to win.
All right. Well, with that, let's take a break. Yeah, with that, let's take a break, and we'll come back and keep talking about this on the other side. Back in a minute. Hey, Chris Webster jumping in from the editing room. So I want to tell you about ArchPodNet.com/members. If you haven't heard already, it's a pretty great membership program. We offer a few things right now. We've got a lot of things coming down the line, but for $7.99 a month, or I think about $84 a year with an annual discount, you get access to our private Slack team where you can talk to hosts and other members about shows or whatever you want to talk about. You can get all our episodes a little bit early, but always ad-free. So things like this, if you're listening to the audio version, you don't have to listen to. And you can subscribe to that ad-free version as well, so they come automatically into your podcast player. Contact us if you don't know how to do that. And you can get access to all of our Cultura live shows and any other live shows or any other shows we did, bonus content, things like that, forever on your member pages. So ArchPodNet.com/members. Back to the show. Welcome back to episode 271 of the CRM Archaeology podcast, and we are continuing our discussion on proposals from episode 270. So again, if you haven't heard that, go take a listen. It's pretty good, awesome information. And Andrew, you started off by telling us, having your students listen to this, it really is good information. And I think you mentioned, I can't remember if it was on this recording or not, that, as a professor, I mean, you haven't had a chance to write a lot of the proposals that we're talking about, but it made me think, grant writing, that's not a whole lot different, and you've probably written tons of those.
No, it's hilariously similar. And I have done some proposals too, but again, not in the super organized CRM way, as you guys sure. know what I mean. In that sort of fill
structured.
in the blank. Yeah, extremely structured way. But it's all the same. It's all these basic things like know your audience. That you have to know the audience of the grant. I was thinking of one, I swear, there was this one grant. It should have been called We Give Andrew Kinkella Money Grant, because it was exactly what I do, right? I was like, I'm going to get this. And just like you guys said, I put a lot of work into it. I tried really hard and I didn't get it. And I was like, what? What did I not do? I was shocked. But then on the other side, there was this other grant where I was like, dude, I got 14% chance. And then I put it in and I got it, surprisingly. So although the output is different, being a grant or a proposal, the setup's the same, the knowledge of audience is the same, the doing your own due diligence is the same. So it's a very similar ride, on both of those things.
Yeah. Doug.
I was just going to talk to, because you will probably have some listeners who are maybe in grad school, maybe get involved in that sort of aspect of doing grant writing and then move on into CRM, or as the way is going with academia, probably half of them are going to have to end up in CRM anyways. But it's one thing to sort of think about Andrew has definitely talked about, it is fairly similar. I'd say the biggest difference, and this is huge and key, is that when you're doing, and we discussed this earlier, and it's sort of a running theme about you want to be inventive, but you don't want to be too inventive. Whereas in academic grant writing, you basically need to come up with your own sort of proposal. And there's a much narrower range that you have when you're doing CRM. And then it'll depend on the funder as well. Some are like, yes, definitely, we like this creativeness. And some are like, nope, I've told you exactly what I want. I want these many trenches or this much area surveyed this way. If you deviate even like a millisecond off of that timing I've given you, we're throwing away your proposal. So it tends to be a lot tighter in the range of what you can do. And I've seen this happen. I think it could be a hard transition for some people who've gone for writing with grants and for academia, there'll usually be some sort of guidelines and you sort of have to be there, but you're basically writing a whole new project from scratch and you have a much higher level of control. And I've seen a lot of people run into a lot of trouble. There was definitely recently one of the few cases with the CIFA, which is the UK's sort of equivalent to RPA, actually kicking someone out because basically they treated a commercial project like their own personal research project and charged their client for it for things that they weren't supposed to be doing. And they got complained against, and then they did it again and got kicked out. But yeah, that's I'd say the biggest difference is a lot of it is almost exactly the same. You have to have a budget, you have to have timings, you have to have why we're doing this. Everything's very similar, maybe slightly different wording, slightly different headings, but very similar. But the biggest difference, I would say, is it's much narrower in the range of what you can do in most cases. Occasionally, you do get a client who's just like, yeah, here's some money, do make magic happen. But that rarely happens.
Yeah. Heather, go ahead.
Remember, I'm on mute. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on. I would say probably 60 to 70% of the proposals that I write, the client's trusting that I know what needs to happen. So I would say even more than that. I would say maybe 70 or 75%. I think only 25%, at least for me, of the proposals. Now, of course, Doug, you're working. You're not working in the U.S., but so it might be different. But they're relying on us to be the experts and to know what is required. There's a lot of pushback. It happens a lot on a regular basis, actually. And maybe that's because I work more with private clients, but there is a lot of pushback. They're like, well, exactly why do I have to do this? And so there's, I enjoy those questions because it allows you, and I think this is, one good point to bring up, it allows you the opportunity to create a relationship with your client or your prospective client. So, you have to tread lightly, but there are good clients and good business people are looking at the bottom line. Exactly what do I have to do? And they are very skeptical. I've come across a lot of clients that are very skeptical that really, is this something we really need to do? Because there are a lot of, I can think of several companies right now in our area that really, create scenarios for clients that are not really necessary, where they're having them do work that they really don't need to have them do. So I think that, it's an opportunity as a professional to create a relationship when you get a question from a client. And that is something that I think is also something we should talk about is, sometimes it's not just you submit the proposal and then you either get a yes or a no. Sometimes there is this liminal state in between where you're interviewing. Sometimes there's formal interview process. Sometimes there is a back and forth with the client because they're really trying to figure out it. Wow. Like I was thinking it was going to cost $20,000 and you came back with $100,000 bid. And maybe this is something I need to do, but is it really something I need to do? And so, having those conversations are difficult because you have to know what you're talking about. And you also have to be able to communicate in a layman's term. But it is a really good opportunity to develop a relationship with the client. I have a few more things to say, but I'll leave it open to everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong, especially if you're not dealing with an agency, right? Agencies usually have a pretty good handle, I think, on what it might cost or what the effort will be for a certain area. They're really into it. They've done lots of these, or they have a historical backlog to look at. But especially in places like California, where there's a lot of just a lot of private archaeology going on because of the laws and regulations there. yeah, you might be dealing with somebody that's never had to do a cultural resources assessment before, or, has very little experience with it. And again, what Andrew said, and I think what you've also said, Heather, is knowing your audience, right? And if your audience is some small time developer, don't talk to them like they're a BLM archaeologist, right? Talk to them
Right.
like they possibly don't know what they're talking about, and be like, hey, so I'll send you this proposal, but just so you know, this is probably the things that are going to have to be done. And, are you guys ready for this? I actually had that happen here in, here, not in Reno, but in Reno. I don't know actually how this guy even found me. I think he found me on LinkedIn or something like that. But it was really a small project. He'd never had to do anything before. And the only reason they had to have a cultural resources assessment on this one spot of private land was because a couple of streams came down the hill and went right across the property. And those streams were under Army Corps regulation. So because of that Army Corps influence, they had to have a cultural resources assessment done. So, I did a lit search and sent them a proposal. And I don't even think they were looking at anybody else, to be honest, but I had to prep him ahead of time for, what this is going to be. It turns out it wasn't that expensive in the grand scheme of things, but, it's helpful to give them a little bit of a hand. Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, I would say, and this is just sort of a general life thing, but it ties in well, it's also not necessarily just knowing your audience, but asking your audience what they know.
Yeah.
Because you can really insult people quite quickly by either assuming they know what you're talking about or assuming they don't know what you're talking about. I usually go with a solid, like, please stop me if I'm talking, or I ask a sort of a series of like leading questions of like, okay, so have you done this before? How many projects is this something, get a little bit of a thing. And I'll just be honest. I'll say, I'm going to go over this. I don't want to like belittle you, but I don't also want us to miscommunicate. So apologies if anything happens, and I go over stuff with people and I say, try to figure out their level there. But I'd say if anyone's listening to this, do not assume a level of understanding. And I'd also say, like, don't assume a level of understanding of fellow archaeologists, but they're the ones who are going to definitely be the most testy. If they don't know something, they will definitely feel hurt and insulted. They're the most easiest to insult, I find.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are, 3 or 4 minutes from the end of this segment, but I think let's take a break now because we can wrap this whole thing up with a discussion of what to do after you win the proposal, and then kind of wrapping up the project and what all that means on the other side of this. So we'll do all that in one segment when we get back in a minute. Hey everybody, Chris Webster one more time, archpodnet.com/members. I know I say it pretty fast, but it's right there. So archpodnet.com/members. If you don't want to hear ads, if you don't want to hear me do this, then, tell somebody about our membership and it'll help us out because we're just trying to be sustaining. This isn't a day job for any of us. It's purely something we do for fun, but it does have costs, right? And we want to keep this going and we want to provide more and we want to free up our time to do more of these things, which means we've got to pay some people to do stuff like this, what I'm doing right now, editing. So let's get back to our proposals episode, our second proposals episode of the CRM Archaeology podcast. Thanks a lot. Welcome back to the third and final segment of episode 271 for the CRM Archaeology podcast, and it's proposals part 2. And now we're going to talk about the fun part. What happens when you win a proposal? What do you do? What does that actually mean? Who do you have to communicate with? What kind of stuff do you have to put into motion? And really, I mean, this all depends on probably 2 primary major factors. A, how big is the project you just won? And B, how big is your company, right? Because if you won a big project and you could just like roll into this because you guys are planning on it, you got people coming off another one, there's a lot of logistics to take place. If you're a smaller company and maybe you're not doing a lot of work, then it might be okay to do this and not have too much of a disruption. But still, like myself, like I mentioned last time, I mean, those big projects I had for the Navy, I mean, I really had to put a lot of stuff into place. Like I said, I had to get a loan. That's when I bought my Tacoma because I knew I was going to have to rent vehicles, but I also knew I was ready for a company vehicle. So, I bought that to not have another rental, but to have an asset. And then I still had to rent 2 other vehicles for the project. So it was, and I had to rent them for, like 10 months. That ends up getting really expensive. if I had the space to store other vehicles, I probably should have just bought another one, but I really didn't. So, I don't have a huge office. I'm not a huge company. So anyway, that's some of the things to think about, and just the logistics of the whole thing, which kind of is my favorite part. I love logistics. I love figuring out the pieces and where things go. It's kind of my sweet spot, project management, that side of things. And it's really fun. If that's not your sweet spot, then you need to hire somebody who it is for, because if you don't get the logistics right, you're really going to mess this up. So,
Very
Doug.
true.
Yeah. Well, this actually sort of ties back into our first bit with when Heather was talking about like what projects you shouldn't go for, because it always sucks to not get a project, but sometimes winning sucks as well. And I think part of that decision is, when you're thinking about this, you should actually be thinking about, I know we say, and in theory, you should be thinking about winning when you're putting together your proposal and where everything happens. But I find this, especially with a lot of smaller organizations, they don't think strategically about that. So, one of the things, especially if you're deciding what to go for, is like, when are the start dates? And when do things are likely going to roll? Or what sometimes happens is there are not really hard start dates. They'll let you know when they're partially through or they're ready to be stripping some soil or something like that. And that's when they're going to call you in to do monitoring or something like that. And you have no control, and you maybe have like a week's notice, or like, hey, want to stop by tomorrow sort of notice, which always sucks and is always fun. But yeah, I think in terms of like, once you've won, you should actually have been planning I know it sounds weird, and in theory, you are planning by putting in a proposal to win, but actually you should really plan before you even put in that proposal what happens if you win, and you should be timetabling your resources and thinking about what's going to be coming down the pipeline and when. Because no matter what you do and how well you plan, 6 things are always going to happen on that 1 week.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, I think this is really important for people to understand, specifically for those that are working in the field and maybe they don't have a potential of writing a proposal, at least at this point in their career. But this is why CRM is rife with last minute requests. This is why people are, constantly calling you last minute, because, you win the proposal. It's not like you win the proposal, okay, now we start right away. It doesn't work that way. A lot of times the clients win the proposal, but there's a lot of things that the agencies, at least in California, agencies have. So if you're working with a client where they're the applicant and your client is the applicant, not the agency, even with an agency, but more so when the applicant is the client, there are so many things they have no control over: permits, things that they may not have even thought of, things that the agencies weren't all that organized and they didn't think of, and now nothing can happen until they get a grading permit or other types of permits. And so, it's not just as simple. Now, when you're doing an investigation, it's a little different. But when it comes to monitoring and any kind of mitigation work that you proposed on, that is where, you don't really have a whole lot of control. And unfortunately, that's why we come up with a lot of last minute requests, because our clients don't have control, or maybe they're not that organized, and they're like, save the day, please. I think the first thing that I do, it all depends on whether or not it's a mitigation effort or it's an investigation effort. Investigation effort, you do have a lot more control. And we have set up task strategies that we know as soon as I tell our team we've won this project, they know we're do this, 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 this. It is, in fact, we've created a Trello card. We have everything set up so everybody knows it's this kind of project. These are the things that need to happen. And there's not even any thought about it. Sometimes they'll ask because there's certain things, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But for the most part, having a organized management task list is really essential to doing things in an efficient way. Yeah. Chris, you had something to say.
I've just got to echo that. I'm so glad to hear you guys use something like Trello that is not only easy to organize, but it's also something that can be shared easily enough, and it's free. I mean, you can pay for it, and we actually do for the APN for several things that we need to do. But for like 99% of what you need to do, it's a free, can be like a light project management tool. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And there's project management software out there, but for certain size projects, especially if you're running concurrent projects all the time, I mean, you need this open communication between you and the people that are running it, the people that are paying for it, everything. And if you don't have, it goes back to logistics. If you don't have that, this thing can go sideways real fast if you're holding
Yeah.
on to information and then all of a sudden maybe you can't provide that information. And where's that housed? Where is that information that we need?
Yeah.
I don't know how many times I've been on a project where in the first week we still don't know what the agency defines as a site, because the company just sent
Yeah.
us out there. This is before I owned my company, without really giving us any briefing information on what we're actually doing out there and looking. We just start walking and recording stuff, and
Yeah.
we have no definitions, and there's no
Yeah.
place we can look to find them. So yeah, go ahead.
That I would say is, that's a really good point. Being organized out the gate is essential to making sure that you don't have something called scope creep, right? I think a lot of people have, we already talked a little bit about that. The one way that you avoid scope creep is to make sure that you have a very specific and well-written proposal that has assumptions that from your own personal experience where things can go sideways, where misunderstandings could happen, where you wrote you were going to do this and actually your language isn't tight enough that it could be understood that it's included in your proposal. So having the assumptions first is your first step to avoiding scope creep. The second thing is to really understanding what your effort is, so that you're able to identify tasks that are coming up that the client is asking for, that are outside of the scope and can really eat up your budget very quickly. So, and then the other thing is putting a good team in there that knows how to make things happen. I mean, and you have to show people how to make things happen. You can't just throw people into the field and say, get this done. Like, you have to have parameters, and you can't, as a project manager, be afraid to give those parameters. You have to say, like, it needs to get done in this time. Usually what I do is I anticipate. One of the things, I think we talked about this, when you're putting together an investigation, you have to look, like, many times it's far away from where you are, so you can't go and put boots on the ground and see what you're dealing with. But you have to go on Google Earth. You have to look at the topo maps. Going on Google Earth isn't good enough. Looking at the topo maps, knowing what the terrain is going to be like, so you know how quickly people are going to be able to get through the area. Those things are really important, because I've learned the hard way, where I've said, "Oh, guys, this is an easy project," and they get out into the project, and not only do you have a this undulating, right, terrain, but you have poison oak, right? So there's all different ways that you can anticipate what it's going to be like out there. But let's say you did perfectly and you really had a good understanding of what your terrain and what the environment is like, giving your crew, say, this is what I'm expecting it's going to take. This is what we've budgeted for. And so that they have some parameters. Otherwise, you're just throwing them in there and you're not allowing them to be successful out in the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point, Doug.
So just a slight step back on, like, planning and resourcing, and what Heather was going on about how we don't always know when projects are going to happen, and what is actually happening in that project. Sometimes you're sent out
Mm-hmm.
into the field with no idea, because it's not a lot of communication. And I have to say, this is I think one of the biggest weaknesses I see in CRM anywhere in the world is there's a lack of communication, and a lot of lack of communication all throughout. So you have, I don't think people have gotten, until you actually are dealing with project management. Most I'd say techs don't understand that, actually, like, it's not that people are trying to screw you over with, we might have work next week, we might not, and it feels like you're being strung along. That's literally because you don't know what's going to happen next week. I've been on projects where it was one of the projects, the big one, was the border fence one, where they didn't actually have to do. They'd gotten rid of all the regulations, but they decided to do it anyways. But basically, we were out there week to week, and eventually they just shut it down. It was always week to week on. Well, maybe we'll come back next week. Maybe we won't. We have no idea because they didn't know what would happen. But I do find there's a lot of communication that's not told onto text, and I understand why some people do it, because they're afraid if they don't have work, then people will start looking for work and leave their other project early. And I'm not sure if there's an answer or solution to this, but I really do wish that more employers and employees would have like a good conversation and say, look, guys, these are the potential projects we have. We don't know when they're going to start. They may start, they may not. There may be some time between, and I wish there was better communication where people could say like, okay, that's too much risk for me. I need to go find a different job. Can I give you a couple of weeks notice? And instead of the normal of like, oh, I'm not going to be back next week, I got a different job, which really angers managers. But honestly, it's what you got to do, because you shouldn't. There's always that risk of you say, oh, I'm looking for another job, and then they just completely cut you off right there. I think this sort of goes back to a lot of conversations we have on this podcast. Is there's two conversations we have. One is how we'd like to see things, and one is a lot of advice we give on what things are to do. And of course, like the advice I'd give on in the current situation is, always look out for number one. Do not have that conversation about how you're thinking about going to a different employer. But the other conversation I'd like to have, or the other thing I'd say, is I wish we could have that conversation. I wish I could say you should talk to your employer and be like, big risk. I need to find something a little bit more steady. Yeah. And I think there are a few places that does happen. But in general, probably the advice is, don't say that, because you can lose work.
Indeed. Andrew?
Yeah, I'd just like to go back to that idea that Heather was talking about of scope creep. I love that phrase. And I would say that if you win the proposal, one of the first things you almost want to plan for is the end of the project. What, like have that idea in your mind, like, okay, this will take about this long with these resources, and it will end somewhere right around here. So we're going to utilize our resources and then have enough to just, and maybe a little cushion, but to have that end point. Because I've seen that before. People who win a project, win a bid, whatever, and they have no idea about the end, and it's like, no, you need to now know the whole story to the end. I always like to think of it as like a scuba dive, where it's like, okay, I've gotten this proposal and we're going to do this. I'm going to go down for 30 minutes and then I have to come up and be prepared for that.
Yeah. There's no scope creep with the scuba, though. Scope creep is you die.
Right.
I would say a couple things, like just piggybacking off of what Andrew's saying. Well, first I'm going to say something about what Doug said. I'm glad he said at the end that there are some companies that you can do that with. As soon as you identify that is a company, because I'll say when we hire as needed, I have a conversation with that as needed employee and I tell them, listen, this is the way as needed works. And I do not want you to just rely on this company. I had this conversation with newer people, especially that are just entering CRM, said it is on you. You're as needed at this point. It is on you to find work. And I'm telling you that I encourage you to work for other companies, because as much as I would love to have enough work for you, I have to make sure that I have enough work for a lot of people. And so I want you to, actively go. In fact, you can put my name, but when it gets to a certain point, if I know that they're good at what they do and I'm willing to, recommend them, I said, put my name on your resume as a contact, but I encourage people to do that. When you have a manager who's doing that, then you got to be straight up with that person, because you want to, that's a good employer. And you want to protect that relationship. That's an employer you can trust. So you don't want to be playing this game where you're going to hold things back, because when you do that to a manager who's a who's working with you in an honest way, and then you're not working with them in an honest way, that's a real good way to negatively impact your relationship with a really good employer. And that's not what you want, right? You want to eventually get a full-time job with a good employer. So if you're kind of burning your bridges with good employers, that's not the best move. So I do think I agree with Doug. There are going to be some situations where you do need to, and you're going to have to suss that out and figure out who you're going to be forthright with and who you're not. But don't go across the board and not and be that way across the board. I think that's a mistake. Chris?
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Heather, too, because now I'm speaking to all the field techs out there. You have to watch out for yourself. If you are an as needed or a shovel bum or temporary field tech, whatever you want to say, I mean, you have to know that you are the one that's responsible for your career. Don't think that even just because the company says, "Oh, we've got tons of work this summer, you're definitely going to have work after this." Sure, take that as, yeah, okay, that's great if it happens, but don't assume it's going to happen, because the reality is they have several priorities. The first one is everybody on their staff and their payroll. That has to be it. That's how you run a business. If that's not their priority, they'll be out of business soon, right? So if they don't win the projects they thought they were going to win, which is what they're basing their statement to you on, is that they've put in all these proposals, they know all this work is, but they haven't won that work. If they have, great, show me the money. But if they haven't, it's promises and hopes and dreams, right? So, but keep an eye out for yourself. And you can, if you're not working for somebody that understands that you have to keep an eye out for yourself and you have to go to the projects that make sense for your life because this is how you work, then you shouldn't work for those people at all, right? And conversely, if somebody offers you a job for when you're done with this project, but I hate to say it, something better or more solid comes along, and you have to tell those guys, no, I can't actually work on your project. Well, honestly, if they don't understand too, that's just how this business works. You don't want to burn those bridges too many times and accept something and say no too many times. But within reason, you've got to watch out for yourself. And I'll say one more thing too, to people who are permanent with companies as well. There's nothing permanent if there's no projects coming in, right? You might be salaried, you might be full-time staff, but I'll tell you what, if for some reason the work dries up, you're gone. Like, they're not going to keep you and just like put you in the office. There's no money to pay for you. So unless you have another skill set, your job is only as permanent as the proposals that are coming in. So that's it.
Very
Doug.
true.
Sorry, I'm gonna jump back. We're just jumping all over the place. I was actually gonna say, like, if you have your contract done right, scope creep is an amazing thing. That never-ending project
Oh, absolutely.
that just keeps on going, that keeps providing you money. I know that's not what Andrew meant on scope creep, because there's usually
because I've seen it done poorly, where it's like, no, you have 3 days left, dude.
Yeah, no, usually what Andrew's referring to is basically what happened is like you have a fixed contract and then they're like, "Oh yeah, so you budget 30 and we just need you to do something that, it's going to cost you like 60,000 to do. No big deal." That sort of stuff sucks. But yeah, I think this goes back to the project and what's your contract and how you've got it set up. But you can end up on those sort of never-ending projects that just go on for years upon years and provide steady work after getting that first contract. If
Right.
you've got it done correctly, and again, man, always make sure you have your contracts done correctly. If there's one thing you should spend money on, is like a lawyer to give you some good terms and conditions and contracts if you can write it. Like, again, some jobs, they're basically like, sign at the dotted line, you're using our contract, it's 400 pages long, you're screwed 6 different ways, just like that third paragraph, but you have no choice. That happens. But yeah, if you can get a good never-ending project, those things can be really wonderful.
Right.
So,
but I think
I
we're just talking on the two sides of professionalism. If you're professional, then yeah, that can happen. And there are certain projects that have a reason to go on, but then there's others that have every reason to end, and then the person is just like not professional and is making foolish decisions.
I think
Indeed.
for me, where scope creep comes in the most is when you have a client who needs some hand holding, or some things happen let's say you find a resource and now you have to address that resource. That's actually the easiest scope creep and the most beneficial scope creep to us as professionals, because it is, like Doug says, it extends your project and the money that comes in. But the scope creep is when you have a client who is very needy and they want some extra hand holding, or you have an agency that's really trying to put the screws to your client, and now you're having to step in and be an advocate for your client. That happens a lot because your client doesn't know the business and they don't know if they're getting screwed by the agency or not. And so, your job as a client or as a professional is to advocate for your client. And so that's where the scope creep can come in. And that's where you have to have those conversations. But mostly your clients typically are professional people. They understand that these things happen and you're looking out for them, and that it does cost more money in order for you to be able to, help them in these different ways. But I think the one thing that I would like to say also to those that are, to those that work in the field, is that when your project manager tells you that, sometimes you're going to be out there and you're going to be doing a survey, let's say, and you find a resource, and your project manager, your field supervisor has told you that this is the way the project is going to go. You're not going to record anything. You're going to take a point and move on. There's a reason behind that. It's because that is not included in recording a site, is not included maybe
Right.
in the proposal. And then that is going to occur later. I see sometimes on social media where people say, oh, well, people are, they're not being responsible. They're not recording the resource. And that's not what's going on. Like, don't assume the worst. What's happening is that you're having a survey, you take a point, and then you come back later when you can put together another contract amendment in order to deal with the resources that were found that you didn't expect. So, that it's important that those that are in the field understand that the direction you're being given are being given because the contract has specific expectations. Right.
Right. Doug.
Yeah, I would say my primary experience with scope creep actually tends to be from other archaeologists who actually wish they were running the project. You get this a lot of times where obviously the archaeologist who is on the other side of the project, many times they want it to be run in a certain way, and they may, man, we've tied back into our first segments and stuff with Heather talking about various things on, well, sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. I'll just cut and say it's basically, yeah, a lot of times I tend to see it mainly coming from people who are like, oh, I want to run this project this way. It should be run my way. And they're not, that's actually not their job. And yeah, that's where I see the most creep coming in.
Right. I just have one kind of quick question too for Heather and the rest of you guys. The proposal is so important and you can justify things using the proposal. Is it possible to give a copy of the proposal to the crew, or is that like too odd?
Sometimes,
because you can say like,
well, so that's a really good point. Sometimes I will either give the proposal. Our team knows exactly where the proposals are. So I encourage them to look at a proposal. So the only time that you wouldn't do that, there's sometimes you have conditions you can't do that, right? You have some confidentiality. But for the most part, I do give the proposals to the crew, at least the crew supervisors, right? So they have an idea of why we're doing what we're doing. I think they have buy-in a lot easier that way. And if the other option is to write a work plan. And it's very easy to extract. If you write a proposal correctly, it's easy to extract a work plan from your proposal. And so if you're not going to give the proposal, you can at least give a work plan. And that definitely allows people to have buy-in. When you're just like barking out orders without any understanding behind it, that's not fair.
Yeah, no, I think that's huge. And I think it kind of wraps up with what Doug was saying earlier, with you'll have these sort of almost bullying archaeologists who want this certain thing, and you can go to them and be like, in the proposal it says this, and this is what we're doing, so stop it. And that can be a really powerful ally, your own proposal.
Yep. Agreed.
Or it could piss them off more.
Well,
Yeah.
okay.
So what? It's a business. Like
Yeah, true.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
It's the legal bit, but yeah, sometimes you have to walk that thin red line of because technically
Well, we have somebody like
they
that. I
will
just
be your
don't hire them
client.
again.
And
Yeah.
sorry, Heather, you said
I just said if I have somebody like that and they're not following, the work plan, that might be their last project. Like
Yeah.
I don't care how good they are. If you're not working for us, you're working for us as a company. If you don't have that attitude, I'm sorry, I can't have you on the project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that is an excellent point. I mean, if you're not following the rules, if you're not playing ball with the company and how that company operates, then, you find another company to work for, or they'll find another field tech to work for them. I mean, that's just how that goes. There has to be a synergy there. So, but I'll end this with, I'm just very glad that the concept of a work plan came up, because a proposal can easily develop into a work plan, because a lot of the things you're going to do in the work plan are in the proposal. And just like proposals and reports, you probably have, and you should, if you do these all the time, and every project should have a work plan, you should have a template for that, because the work plan contains not only the elements of the proposal that say, here's what we're doing and how we're doing it and why we're doing it, but here's the, emergency evacuation routes. Here's the nearest hospitals. Here's the, all the other stuff that you need in a work plan for your health and safety stuff, for, the whole thing. That is the Bible for the project. And every crew should have a copy of the work plan available to them, either digitally, offline, or, as a PDF or something like that, because it's got that crucial information in it. So anyway, we could continue on this for a really long time, probably, because there's always something to say about this. But I'm interested in hearing everybody else's thoughts. Hit us up on, Facebook if you saw this. I am one of the admins of the Archeo Field Techs group, and the hosts of this podcast. Most of them are also in the Archeo Field Techs group, and that's kind of the biggest group that we have on Facebook to talk about and share, field related experiences. We can't really share this episode there. So if you're listening to this and you're over there, it's a little self-serving to do that, and I understand that. But if you like this episode, please help us out and share it over there so it can generate these conversations. Sometimes I just will, if I think, man, this really needs to get out, and I'll just, suffer the consequences of somebody saying me, look at you're self-promoting yourself in your own group. But anyway, I don't care. It's good stuff, right? So help us out and maybe share it out. And if you've got any comments.
Yeah. It's not like we get paid for this, Chris.
I know.
I mean, we're doing this because we don't do this so we can sit in a room. Yeah, you're not getting paid, Andrew.
I get it.
I have a special deal. I'm not aware of.
Wait, no. I thought we were all getting paid. Yeah, I thought we were all getting paid. Wait, Chris?
Coffee is cold.
Is Heather the only one not getting paid, Chris? Is that? I see some things here, man. That's gonna blow up on Facebook for you there, Chris.
Yeah.
All right. Well, paying you guys was not in my work plan or my proposal, so I'm going to
ultimate scope creep.
All right, guys.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right. Well, thanks a lot for this episode is approaching scope creep right now on segment 3. Anyway, thanks a lot, guys. This has been a great 2-episode series. I hope we can do some more little mini series like this. And with that, we'll see you guys in 2 weeks with whatever Andrew wants to talk about. Back then. Thanks to everyone for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you in the field. Goodbye.
Bye, everybody.
See you guys next time.
Yeah, I'm going to take that as a win. Their pause was a win right there. I have nothing else to say. That's me done. They've taken my job from me, Chris.
I cut those out,
contracts. Right? Man, we need to go back to that contract we have.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Culturo Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.